A world war is not just a battle. It's not just one country fighting another over a piece of land. It's a vast, sprawling conflict that pulls in nations from every corner of the globe. It's a total war, where the line between the battlefield and the home front blurs until it disappears completely. Factories that once made cars now build tanks. Farms that grew food for families now feed armies. The war becomes the single, all-consuming focus of entire societies. It reshapes borders, topples governments, and changes the very course of human history in ways that are felt for generations. The 20th century saw two such conflicts. They were called simply the First World War and the Second World War. These were not distant events fought by soldiers in faraway fields. They were global storms that swept up millions of ordinary people. A farmer from Iowa could find himself in the muddy trenches of France. A shopkeeper from Kyoto might be sent to a remote island in the Pacific. These wars connected the world in a web of violence and shared struggle. They forced nations that had little to do with each other into alliances, creating a domino effect where a single event could ignite a worldwide fire. These conflicts were defined by their immense scale. They involved dozens of countries and hundreds of millions of people. The fighting spanned continents and oceans, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the dense jungles of Southeast Asia. New technologies of destruction were unleashed, making warfare more deadly than ever before. The machine gun, the airplane, the submarine, they all changed how wars were fought. The sheer number of casualties, both military and civilian, was staggering and had never been seen before. Entire cities were turned to rubble, and landscapes were scarred beyond recognition. The idea of a world war itself became a new concept. Before the 1900s, wars were typically regional, but industrialization, colonialism, and a complex network of treaties had tied the fates of nations together. When a Serbian nationalist assassinated an Austro-Hungarian archduke in Sarajevo in 1914, it set off a chain reaction that engulfed the globe. It showed how interconnected the world had become. A single shot could echo across continents, drawing millions into a conflict that would redefine the meaning of war and leave an indelible mark on the human soul. Out of the terrible crucible of global conflict, unexpected changes emerged. War has always been a powerful driver of innovation, and the world wars were no exception. The desperate need for an advantage on the battlefield pushed science and technology forward at a breathtaking pace. Things we now take for granted were born from this urgency. Penicillin, the miracle drug that has saved countless lives, was mass-produced to treat wounded soldiers. Radar, developed to detect enemy aircraft, is now essential for air traffic control and weather forecasting. Jet engines, nuclear power, and even early computers all trace their origins back to the immense pressures of wartime research. The wars also dramatically reshaped societies, particularly for women and minority groups. With millions of men sent overseas to fight, a massive labor shortage opened up on the home front. Women stepped into roles they had never been allowed to fill before. They worked in factories, built airplanes, and ran farms. They proved they were just as capable as men, and this experience fueled the fight for greater equality and suffrage in the years that followed. Similarly, minority soldiers who fought for freedom abroad returned home with a renewed determination to fight for their own civil rights, planting the seeds for future social justice movements. On a global scale, the devastation of two world wars forced nations to seek new ways to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. The failure of the League of Nations after World War I led to the creation of a stronger, more influential body, the United Nations. Its purpose was to provide a forum for countries to resolve disputes through diplomacy rather than combat. This marked a profound shift in international relations. It was an admission that global problems required global cooperation. The goal was to build a world where dialogue could replace destruction and shared interests could overcome national rivalries. This new spirit of cooperation extended to other areas as well. Alliances formed during the war laid the groundwork for future partnerships. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was created to ensure collective security in Europe. Economic institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were established to help rebuild shattered economies and foster global financial stability. The world that emerged from the rubble was one that was, in many ways, more interconnected and interdependent than ever before. The shared trauma of war had ironically pushed humanity toward building a more collaborative and peaceful international order. For all the unintended progress, the price of world war is always unimaginably high. The most immediate and devastating cost is the loss of human life. The numbers are almost too large to comprehend. Tens of millions of soldiers and civilians killed. Each number represents a person with a family, a story, a future that was cut short. These were not just soldiers on a battlefield. They were people in cities hit by bombs, families torn apart by occupation, and victims of genocide. This immense loss leaves a deep, hollow space in the heart of nations, a wound that takes generations to heal, if it ever heals at all. Beyond the loss of life is the physical destruction. Entire cities were flattened, reduced to skeletons of brick and steel. Homes, schools, hospitals, and churches, places that formed the fabric of daily life, were wiped off the map. Farmland was poisoned, infrastructure was destroyed, and economies were left in ruins. The effort to rebuild took decades and consumed vast resources that could have been used for progress and prosperity. Even today, in some parts of Europe and Asia, you can still find the physical scars of the wars. Unexploded bombs buried in fields, abandoned bunkers, and memorials that stand as silent witnesses to the devastation. The psychological trauma of war lingers long after the last shot is fired. Soldiers who survived the horrors of the trenches or the brutality of island hopping came home with invisible wounds. They suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. They carried with them nightmares, anxiety, and a sense of alienation that made it difficult to return to a normal life. This trauma did not just affect the soldiers, it affected their families and their communities. Civilians who lived through bombings, starvation, and fear carried those scars with them for the rest of their lives, passing a legacy of anxiety and sorrow down to their children. World wars also create political problems that last for many years. The redrawing of borders after World War I, for instance, created new nations and new tensions in places like the Middle East and Eastern Europe, conflicts that continue to this day. The end of World War II did not bring universal peace, but instead gave rise to the Cold War, a decades-long standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. This rivalry divided the world into two opposing camps, fueling proxy wars, an arms race, and a constant fear of nuclear annihilation. The political fallout of these global conflicts reshaped the world map and created new sources of instability that still challenge us today. Understanding the history of world wars is more than just an academic exercise. It's a vital and necessary act of remembrance. We study these conflicts to honor the memory of the millions who sacrificed so much. By learning about their experiences, the fear, the courage, the loss, we ensure that their stories are not forgotten. We keep their memory alive, not to glorify war, but to understand its true human cost. In the silence of the cemeteries and the solemnity of the memorials, we are reminded of the price of hatred and the fragility of peace. It's our duty to listen to those silent lessons. Studying these wars also helps us understand the world we live in today. The political map, the alliances that bind nations, and the international institutions that govern our world were all forged in the fires of these conflicts. Why is there a United Nations? Why does NATO exist? Why are certain borders in the Middle East or Africa so contentious? The answers to these questions lie in the history of the world wars. Without understanding this past, we cannot fully grasp the present. It provides the context for today's headlines and helps us see the long shadows that history casts upon our current events. Learning about the causes of world wars is perhaps the most important lesson of all. These conflicts did not appear out of nowhere. They were the result of a toxic mix of nationalism, militarism, imperialism, and failed diplomacy. They were fueled by economic desperation, political ambition, and the dehumanization of others. By studying how these forces led the world down the path to war, we can learn to recognize the warning signs today. When we see aggressive nationalism on the rise, when diplomacy breaks down, or when one group of people is vilified, history reminds us of the terrible places that path can lead. Ultimately, the study of World War is a profound lesson in empathy. It forces us to look at the world from the perspective of others, the soldier in the trench, the mother trying to feed her children during a famine, the refugee fleeing a burning city. It reminds us of our shared humanity and the common desire for peace and security. It teaches us that war is not a game played by leaders on a map. It's a human tragedy with real and lasting consequences. By remembering the horrors of the past, we arm ourselves with the wisdom and compassion needed to build a more peaceful future. One where global conflict remains a history lesson, not a current event.